Hey there, and welcome to another episode of Life Design Plus, where we are mastering the art of living your authentic life. I am excited for you to meet my new friend, Maura McInerney-Rowley, who is doing some great work over at Hello Mortal. And I stumbled across Maura over on Twitter, which is where I find a lot of my guests, and was instantly intrigued by her conversation and her writings around death and mortality. And I've been thinking about this subject a lot as I read the Stoics and think about living authentic lives and Kinder's 3 questions, which also center around mortality. And I just thought it'd be a great conversation to have her on and talk about how we are maybe looking at death wrong and how coming to grips with our inevitable death and our mortality can actually help us live a better, more true, authentic life. And one of the cool things about this conversation, and I did not expect this, is we veer off the path of having Maura be the subject matter expert around death and actually talk about her pursuit of following her passions and living her authentic life as well. So this is kind of a double episode in that we get someone's story of following their passions and living their authentic life, along with somebody talking about a subject that we don't talk about a lot because it's uncomfortable and it's scary. But as I think you're going to leave this episode, you're going to be more inspired, as if you can, to think about your mortality and what that means to living your authentic life. So with that, let's get to my conversation with Maura. I'm excited to dive into this because I would say that I used to be, I never thought about death a lot growing up, but I would say I used to be afraid to die. And in the last couple of years, as I've gone on this personal journey that leads me to doing this podcast and spirit, mind, body, and these beliefs I have, I'm not really, death doesn't scare me anymore, with the exception of, and I do want to dive into this a little bit, my only fear of death is missing out on my 3 boys' life going forward. And I obviously will miss my wife very much as well if I'm not here, but there's something different about the relationship of husband and wife. I think she would be okay without me. She would miss me. Obviously she's going to grow over the coming years, but her growth is different than the growth that the boys will have, and father, son, and child and parent is different. So really, over the years, I've come at peace with life and death, other than if something happened to me today, the missing of the boys going forward, I'd be devastated. And what brought me to think about death was reading a lot of the Stoics. So Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Epictetus, I have a memento mori tattoo on my forearm, remember death, which sounds morbid, but it's designed to make you think about living more than it is about death. Remembering death is around the corner, so live the fullest life that you can, which ties into the authentic life. So
absolutely.
I'm excited to learn more from you today about death and what we're doing wrong as a society, how we think about death. But there was something you said in an episode with Kay He. So I was doing my research, preparing, and Kay is a very good friend of mine. I was jealous he got you on the podcast first. But he asked you about the difference, or maybe you brought up the difference of death and dying, that there's a difference between the two. And what I noticed was your face lit up. When that came up, it was ooh, she is excited about that. And I want to, not recant what you did with him, but maybe touch on a little bit. But if there's more that you didn't say in that podcast episode that you wanted to talk about now, about the difference between death and dying.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, I didn't watch or listen to the episode after it was recorded because I can't really stand listening to myself. So I hope your listeners enjoy it. But that topic is really important and interesting to me from my own journey of exploring mortality to where I am now. And that is, we often look at death as a medical event. It's a final process. It's a very clear ending. But what we lack in that understanding is that dying is actually a process, and dying is hard. But there's an opportunity in the dying process to have meaningful moments, even transformative experiences, and that it's never too late to grow even through your dying process, and that it's something that's just often overlooked for obvious reasons why death is taboo. It's getting into the fact that we're afraid of death, we don't talk about death. But for the Hello Mortal newsletter, which I run, we did a really wonderful interview with a palliative care doctor, Dr. Ira Byock, who talks about well-being and wellness at the time of death and dying, and that your death can actually be a positive experience. And what does that mean to have a good death, and what does well-being look like at the time of death and during that dying process?
What can death teach us about living?
So much. So much. Back to your early point about stoicism, and that, death is only morbid if you miss the point, right?
Mm-hmm.
Often we'll start conversations talking about death, but what it leads us back to is the here and right now. And how can we live a more meaningful, more authentic, more fulfilling life right now, while we're still here, while we're still in this body, while we still have time. And I think that, without, death gives meaning to life, just plain and simple. And there's so much we can learn from it.
I don't know if you're familiar with the life planning process in kind of the financial planning world, but George Kinder created his process of helping people kind of figure out what they want out of life and be able to plan for it. And he has 3 questions, and 2 of them center around mortality, but the last one is really the most important one. And it alludes to what you just mentioned. The question is, putting yourself in the shoes of, you go to the doctor today and you find out today is your last day. And I think a lot of people would think the next part of the question is going to be, well, what would you do in the remaining time you have? But the question really is, who did you not get to become? What did you not get to do? What's left undone? And not for whatever reason, for an obvious reason that you just talked about, if you actually put yourself in that situation, truly think about it, then whatever your answers become the focus of your plan going forward. Because if today's your last day and X, Y, and Z are what you would regret, then luckily today's not your last day. So how do we change that so when that time comes, X, Y, and Z are no longer your regrets? So I do think that death, it's the yin and the yang. Death, you can't have living without the death that's going to be on the other side, because that's what forces you to live.
Absolutely. And that reminds me of a great contemplation that Elua Arthur, who I received my death doula training from, posed to us as students, which was, imagine yourself on your deathbed, and what version of yourself do you want to be? And then take a look at yourself right now, and what version of yourself are you? And then assess what's missing, and let's fill that gap as much as possible. And it can be so easy to say, oh, well, if I were to die tomorrow, I'd drain my savings, I'd travel the world, blah, 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 but I'm not going to do that right now for, obvious reasons, or XYZ reasons of, I need to plan for retirement, save for the future. But it's about not living in extremes, and it's about finding a balance of, okay, how can I carve out an hour each day, or a day out of the month on the weekends to start making progress on my goals and the things that are important to me, instead of just living life on autopilot and waiting for that day, which that day will come, but we have no say in it.
I think the thought of not being here in death helps highlight what we value the most. And in your example of, well, if tomorrow's my last day, or I would drain my savings and I would travel, going to finding the happy medium, then it's okay, obviously we're not going to do that, but how can we work in more travel? Obviously that is important to you, if that's one of the first things you thought of. So how do we bring that to today in a way that's reasonable, and in a way that makes your life today better? And when you realize what's most important, and depending on how far you want to go, you can really reprioritize your life to really focus on those things. And maybe you could do more travel than you ever imagined, because you identify these other things you're doing really don't have any value to you. And now you know what's most important.
Right. And for some people, it's not travel. For some people, it's, okay, I'd rent an Airbnb and get all the people I love in there. Or for others, it's, oh gosh, I wish I had started writing that book years ago. It really does truly help you identify, what are those immediate wants and needs and desires that you have,
which will ultimately help shape someone's authentic life and being able to live it. Obviously, this is something that is you're very passionate about. You've shaped your career around this. How did you get to doing the work that you're doing? Because at one point you were a wedding planner, and now you've done a death doula, you've set up a hospice center, and you're doing all those things in addition to Hello Mortal and the things coming along there. So let's jump back and talk about how Maura got to doing the work that you're doing today.
Yeah, I have definitely followed a very windy path
Mm-hmm.
to get where I am, and it's been fueled by curiosity right out of the gate. Also, you know, a supportive environment. Like I reflect a lot about what my parents taught me and having the courage to be curious as
Mm-hmm.
well and follow through on that. Um, and, you know, the way I got to becoming a death doula was very much, it felt like a calling. It felt almost like I was sent on this path,
Mm-hmm.
and I had the choice to follow it or not. But there was a very emotional event that happened between the summer going into my second year of business school. So before business school, was in San Francisco working in early stage startups and venture capital, not thinking about death or dying really at all in the context of a career or business, really only through my own grief of having lost my mother when I was 20. And I was feeling a little lost in my own career, which is part of the reason why I applied to business school. But my intention was, starting a business would be a dream. I didn't think it was necessarily a reality, but it would be a dream. And if not, then I would be pivoting into some sort of like marketing or brand strategy role, things that I really love doing while working with consumer-oriented startups. And the summer going into my second year, I was at a wedding out in Boulder, Colorado. I was reading a poem about lost loved ones because the bride and I had bonded over losing parents around the same age. We'd actually met in Colorado, which is where I moved after college. And so I was set to read this poem on the day of her wedding. And that morning, we found out that one of her friends, a guest at the wedding, we had all been together Friday night at the rehearsal dinner, and then people went out. And we found out the next day, the day of her wedding on Saturday, that one of her friends had died.
Mm.
And you can imagine this was very shocking. It was in an unexpected, very tragic way. And it was the day of her wedding when, we're supposed to be feeling all this joy and love. And it was this huge wave of sadness. And so that poem I read, which I did read, she had the wedding, took on a whole new meaning,
Mm-hmm.
having just lost her friend. And then I went on right after that wedding to go backpacking in Alaska, where I had a scary experience of my own where I fell and I thought, oh no, am I gonna have to get like helicoptered out of the
Oh.
mountains, out of Alaska. And I also, at that same time, was doing a lot of heavy reflection of losing my mom, because through conversations I had with our guide who asked me what the highs and lows of my 20s were. And I immediately know what my low is, which is losing my mom. And it's so profound that I still struggle to come up with a high. But then that experience happened, and immediately after backpacking, I flew back to Michigan, Ross, at business school, and my first class was an entrepreneurship class where I had to pitch a business.
Mm-hmm.
And so, jumping over a few details, that's where I ended up pitching an idea for wilderness hospice care, because I thought how amazing it would be to have your final moments out in the backcountry. I experienced my mother's death on hospice in our own home, and so I wanted to sort of combine those two things. And throughout the semester, I just explored and researched the funeral industry, the hospice industry, and came to the realization that, wow, this is a very outdated industry. It's super fragmented. There's a lot of opportunity here to improve things, to help people. And then I started, given my background as a wedding planner, pitching this idea of sort of a Zola or the Knot for funerals. And that was really interesting to a lot of people. I won some pitch competitions from that. And then throughout that whole process, I was in business school. So it was like, okay, what's going to happen after graduation? What am I going to go do? And I did some internships. I was interviewing for some jobs, but I just felt deeply uninspired by everything that I was interviewing for, like traditional tech or consulting roles. And I was so passionate about this idea I had been pitching. And then I ended up getting COVID. So I missed my graduation, and I had to take about a month off to recover. And so when I came back up for air, I said, okay, student loan payments have been paused. This is probably the only time in my life that feels like a good time. It's never the right time, but feels like a good time to try this entrepreneur thing. And so I went and I used some of my pitch competition winnings to get certified as a death doula and get more experience in the industry, and then started building different ideas I had. One of those was death archetypes. And so that's a really long-winded story of how I got here. But in that example, I hope it shows you that it truly was like these events kept happening to me, and I was just following my curiosity the whole time and decided to take that big leap of faith and go against the grain. It was difficult while, all of my peers were making six figures and having these new, MBA jobs. I was out there trying to just figure it out, following this curiosity.
No, I'm so glad you shared that story and it also gave me a couple points I want to ask before we go further into mortality, because this podcast is hybrid of people pursuing their passions and creating the life they want to live on their terms, which clearly you just described doing. And then also having people who are subject matter experts to kind of educate listeners as well. My original intention was you as the subject matter expert, but now hearing this story, I'm like, no, we got to pause and we got to learn more about kind of the process of pursuing something that is hard, that no one else is doing, that's against the grain, because I think for a lot of people, that path that leads to their authentic, true life is just that. And a couple of questions, not spending too much time on it. You mentioned, you felt like there's this calling to do this work. Mm-hmm. I know what having a calling like that feels like, and it truly is a feeling. I struggle to find the words, and I don't necessarily expect you to have the words that somebody's going to hear and be like, oh, that's what the feeling is like. But I didn't know if you could describe like what that feeling was and how you knew it was something to pursue. The reason being, I think a lot of people have these feelings, but they don't really listen to them. They don't give them the attention that they deserve because they just don't realize that, oh, this is more than just an idea. Like this is something that's pulling at my heart or captivating my mind. So thinking back to that time, like how did you know that this was something to pursue?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I forgot to even mention too, upon graduation, like talk about a calling, things just like falling in my lap is how I went to go on and help open the hospice. So the original idea I pitched in business school of a wilderness hospice basically came to fruition a year later. But the feeling of the calling, I would say, is a couple of different things. One was that, as I mentioned, prior to business school, I had worked in early stage startups and venture capital, and I was very envious of the founders. I was like, oh, I want to build something. What you're doing is so cool. Didn't know what the first thing on how to do that or what it looked like, but wanted to be involved and always loved brainstorming with founders. And so I had lots of ideas over the years of products or companies I would build, some wonderful, some terrible. And so when I had this idea of the knot for funerals, and later that sort of evolved over time to where we are today, it felt right. It was like, okay, wow, I've had hundreds of ideas and I followed some of them through, but this one, for whatever reason, feels right. And I think that was a combination of like, I had a personal connection to the problem. I had experienced the death of my own mother and going through and living through grief. So it was that like personal pain point. And then two was, it felt like for the right timing, like going through COVID, there were companies popping up in this space because they also saw a need. Um, and then I think the other thing was just the juxtaposition of all the other interviews I was doing. I was sort of looking at these two parallel paths, and I said, okay, well, one is very clear to me. I graduate, I take one of these jobs, I move to, a new city, and I sort of know what my life looks like for the next 2 to 4 years. The other one, completely unknown, big black gray cloud area, like I don't know what will happen. And it's really it's really like a fear-based decision to not follow that path, which is understandable. There's so many reasons why someone won't take the leap, and I respect all of those. And for me, again, things just kept either like falling into my lap, or doors were opening, things were happening that I was like, I have to keep going. And some of those were like networking calls, some of those were financial gains, some of those were like just signs I felt like I was seeing. So it was a combination of a lot of different factors.
I don't know if my face while you were talking is going to show up on the final edit, but like, so I was looking, you couldn't have said that at a more perfect time. Because as you were describing that, my next question was going to be, do you remember like doors opening that you didn't know exist? And the reason was this morning on Twitter, I saw an old clip of an interview Joseph Campbell did. And I think it's the interview he did on PBS that they wrote The Power of the Myth. Are you familiar with Joseph Campbell?
No.
He wrote a man of 10,000 Faces. He's basically the guy who created or identified the hero's journey.
Oh,
So
okay.
in the interview, he was asked about, he talks about following your bliss. To me, following your bliss is how I talk about pursue your passions. And in it, he says, when you find your bliss and you're following it, doors will open. Trust your bliss, just follow it almost blindly, because that bliss is leading you where you're supposed to go, and things will magically just happen as they're supposed to. So I was making sure it was The Power of the Myth. I was looking as you were talking, and then you just start saying the things I was going to ask you about. And I'm so glad you did, because just like describing the feeling of being called to something, we can try to put it into words, but you can't describe that feeling. You just know. We also can't convince people that doors will open. Like, we can tell them, but until someone actually experiences an unexpected windfall of money that's exactly the amount they needed and just kind of happened by chance, you can't really believe in it. But I hope that the more stories of people experiencing this on my podcast, they're sharing this, that it's real, people will actually believe in it, which will hopefully allow it to happen to them more, or they'll be able to notice the small door that's just creaked open just a little bit, that's easy to miss. That is the one that opens them all up. So you took my question away from me by the end of that statement, but I'm so glad you shared that.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Okay.
Well, I think that's a great background on how we got here, and also the pursuit of your authentic life and the passions and doing things your way. So I want to come back to mortality and, spending time at the hospice center. I've actually told my wife maybe like 6 months ago, I haven't done it yet, but I kind of want to go spend time at a hospice center, because I have not really been around death. Like, I haven't experienced a death to a close family member that was unexpected. Like, grandparents passed away. So I've experienced death, but not to one where it was unexpected or to where it was prolonged and I like had opportunity to be around it. And I just feel like with what I've read and where I'm at now, there's a lot to be learned at those end of the stage periods. So what did you learn, working in the hospice center or continuing, because you still do the doula work now, right?
Yeah. I recommend to anyone, whether you're interested in mortality or not, to volunteer at a hospice, and maybe wait until you are interested. But and especially trying to find a social model of hospice, because the for-profit hospices, there are some good ones out there, but like you just never know what you're going to get in terms of quality of care, and then experience as a volunteer can vary greatly from each company. But that was one of the most transformative experiences I've ever had, because given the type of model I was in, which is a social model of hospice, so it's really trying to go back to the grassroots efforts of hospice, which is volunteer-based, community-based. It's not for profit, so it's a little bit different. Um, and I took on a hybrid role as the director of operations, but also a resident care provider, which is we have 24/7 around the clock resident care. And that means that there's someone there, typically a CNA, who's readily available to help our residents when they need it, whether that's feeding, changing, bathing, medical administration, companionship, cooking, like all of that. And so, while I had experienced my mother's death on hospice, I'm not a CNA, I'm not a nurse, I'm not a trained caregiver. Obviously got training, but it was like full in, throw you into the fire. And I learned everything. So in my death doula training, which is typically a death doula is considered non-medical care and support for the dying and their loved ones. As a caregiver, I absolutely provided that and more. So I was feeding, changing, administering medication, all those things, just like as if I were someone's family member, because hospice is a philosophy of care, which you can receive in your own home or a facility. And so the hospice I helped open on Cape Cod basically functioned as someone's home, and we had 24/7 care for them, in addition to them being enrolled on medical hospice and them having that whole team of hospice, which is the doctor, the nurse, the social worker, chaplain, etc. And so, I mean, there's so many lessons to learn from hospice, but at the end of the day, I'd say my biggest takeaway that I had was just the importance of building community, because the end of life can be really lonely, and you have to surrender control. And as someone who didn't know they were a type A person until I entered business school and realized, oh wow, I'm a type A person, and I'm also trying to like let that go. But I've really struggled with control my whole life, because my mom dying was out of my control, and therefore like that influenced some of my habits after the fact of, okay, like, well, what I can control what I eat or I don't eat. I can control what I spend or I don't spend on. But certain things in life you can't control. And that is when you're dying or you're sick and you can't take care of yourself in certain ways. You can't change yourself. You can't toilet yourself. You can't feed yourself. You really are dependent on these other people to take care of you. And so trying, like, I feel like my whole life now up until the day I die, which I hope is many, many years from now, is an exercise in relinquishing control and building community and coming to terms that, you know, death is a natural environment and phenomenon, and that we can actually have a lot of meaningful moments at the end of life, and it doesn't have to be, you know, in a hospital. I mean, and obviously it is for some people, but that there's just a whole other way to die that people have no idea about.
I'm noticing a reoccurring theme through a lot of my episodes, and you've touched on a couple already. Curiosity is one of them. So curiosity has been a part of you, and it kind of led you to this, but then also surrendering. And numerous times on episodes, I've talked about the Surrender Experiment by Michael Singer. Have you read that? So it's not the same type of surrendering that you're talking about, but it's still surrendering to the things that we can't control, and that is really, really hard to do. I'm curious if there's any changes that you can think of in the way that you approach your life that you can directly relate to the work that you've been doing around mortality. Like you're doing things differently than before because of what you've seen or learned through your work.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's a constant battle too. Like, I'm always trying to work on it, but stressing less, like way less, to stop stressing about the little things. The things don't really matter. And the caveat is that, like, you know, everyone's stress is different, and you know, this is your unique journey. I'm not here to tell you not to stress about something that is important to you. But that, you know, it's so cheesy, but like every day is a gift. We
Mm-hmm.
never know when we're gonna die. Like absolute, like we don't know. And so trying to remind myself, and even in this conversation, like I'm reminding myself right now that like, let's not stress about the little things, and a very stoic principle of, it's not about, you know, uh, what happens to you, it's about how you react or
Mm-hmm.
how you respond. Um, and it's all easier said than done, but something, through the hospice lens is all that I carry with me are the top regrets of the dying,
Mm-hmm.
and making sure that I'm living a life I'm proud of. And, people will always have regrets, probably in some way, shape, or form, but just trying to minimize those,
Mm-hmm.
because, again, all we have is right now.
And the five regrets of the dying, that's Bronnie Ware, if anybody doesn't know. And the first one I think is very special to me because of what my mission is. It's I wish I would have lived a life more true to myself, or I wish I would have lived my authentic life if I were to rewrite it. So everybody on this show should be aware of those. I've written about them before, but if not, it's a great book. It's a short book, and you can even find like synopsises of what the five are
Mm-hmm.
and break down. But I think that should be something that everybody reads, because it is end of life, and it's looking back, and it's consistent that all of the things that we stress about and we worry about and we think are important, like most of them don't matter in the grand scheme of things. And the things that do matter the most oftentimes are the most simple and the easiest ones for us to do more of, and we lose it. We
Yep.
don't realize it. So I'm glad you mentioned that. I think you had a great comment when you're talking to Kay on that episode is, what do people fear about death? Is it fear of not being here, or it's connected to that, but I like what you had to say. So let me just ask, what do you think people fear about death?
I think people fear all sorts of things,
Mm-hmm.
but they don't necessarily realize what the root cause of their fear is, um, which is just the unknown,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we don't know what happens after death. We have our beliefs and all that, but no one knows for sure. And
Mm-hmm.
so at the root of that is just the fear of unknown. And Ernest Becker, cultural anthropologist, very well known sort of in this field, talks about how at the root of all anxiety is a fear of death.
Mm-hmm.
And so, your fear of unknown could translate into, well, how are my loved ones going to survive without me? Are they going to be okay emotionally, financially? Like that's an unknown, unless potentially you've proactively written perhaps an ethical will or set aside finances, if we're talking like just surface level things.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's a fear of the unknown that we have.
You also mentioned the fear of being irrelevant.
Yeah, yeah.
Tell me more about that.
That's another one that comes up for people and is, I think, really important to discuss now than it was, I don't know, maybe even a decade ago with the technological developments we've seen in AI,
Mm-hmm.
because there's a lot of legacy projects people do intentionally, and then also creative projects people do, whether they subconsciously realize it or not, that like writing a book is making sure your mark is left because you've written something, or music, or your name on a building, or whatever it is. And so there's people have to come to terms with the feeling of irrelevance, and for some it matters a lot, for some it matters not at all. It's definitely like an ego thing. I've seen lots of videos out there that talk about how, like, do you even know your grandparents' names, your great grandparents' names, and that, in a few generations from now, you'll be lost and forgotten. And so if that's something that is, brings up a lot of anxiety and fear for you, there's several different ways to create legacy projects or express yourself. But back to the AI thing is we're starting to see what's called grief bots, that are really just people uploading their voices and videos and making, digital avatars and versions of themselves so that they can be around forever, essentially a way to like immortalize themselves. And that is, we could speak for hours on that topic, but yeah.
That's interesting. I wonder how the AI bot impacts like the grieving process, because I could see how that could potentially like draw it out even longer, or maybe it makes it easier. Like, and maybe it's up to the individual. That's not now that you say that, it's not surprising that's coming, but I had never thought about that before. One of the
Yeah.
cool things about legacy, I had never thought about it before, but one of my clients told me this. He told me he thought it was going to be he thought it was so cool that my great grandkids and great great grandkids would be able to pull up my podcast or my YouTube channel in the future and be able to see the person they never knew and like what I was thinking and whether or not I was cool or not. Like I never thought about that, but then that's one of the things that I do have in the back of my mind of how cool it is to have, documentation of my thoughts and my personal growth for myself, but then generations that will never know me can open this. And same for you, like you're going to be forever on YouTube as long as YouTube exists. And I have in my estate planning, like it spelled out to how to make sure that my digital footprint doesn't go away. Cause websites have to stay open and those types of things. So like, I want to make sure, and I don't know if I don't think it's ego driven. Maybe it is a little ego driven, and I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing, but that is something about all this work that I do I never thought about, but I'm documenting so much that in theory could live on forever, and my future generations could kind of know a little bit about who I am, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think it's wonderful. And ego kind of tends to get a bad rap, and I don't think it's negative at all. And it's interesting you say that because in the death plan that I'm working on, we include stuff about social media, digital afterlife, and like if you want to preserve it or if you want it to be deleted and how you want people to interact with it. And what people probably don't have in their will right now is any sort of language about consent for whether or not they want surviving loved ones to be able to create an avatar of them. And because it wasn't really a thing a few years ago, but now it is, and people have made them, and it's only going to continue to develop. And to your point about prolonging grief, like, yeah, we just don't know. I mean, I certainly see how it could cause very negative consequences for grievers. And on the other side, I can certainly see how it might be a positive experience for some. So I am watching it very, very closely.
As an expert in the field, what's your initial feeling about that grief bot?
My initial feeling was I didn't like it. I do think to a certain extent, like it'll make it harder for people to move on. I did read an article about someone advocating for it to be essentially like a prescription, a medical diagnosis that you could get and, be used under sort of supervision, essentially, as a tool for therapy. So, someone talked about how they created one and then they got the closure they needed and they deleted it. So that seemed like it was a positive experience. But yeah, my initial reaction to it is that I think it's probably going to cause more harm than good.
No good way to get to this next part, but I want to get to the archetypes a little bit. Now, before we get into it, I'm going to encourage everybody to go over to Hello Mortal and find out what their archetype is and read more about it. And if you're interested in it, sign up for the newsletter, go do courses and things that Maura and her team are going to put out in the future. But high level, what made you want to come up with the archetypes? And then kind of how do you see those helping us live a better life?
So the initial concept for the archetypes was born out of creating a test that would help people understand the different options they had for body disposition. So whether you wanted to be cremated or buried or cryogenically frozen, or there's new innovations called aquacremation, which is just water cremation. It's more eco-friendly. There's human composting, which is known by a few other names, and other body disposition method. So originally I made that test to help people educate themselves and then know which one they wanted to choose, because at the end of the day, I think that's one of the most important things you can do for yourself and for anyone you loved, is just make this decision and let it be known. And then even if you want to take further next steps of prepaying for those things or setting aside finances for it, is huge. That way your loved ones aren't having to second guess or make that decision on their own. And so that's where it started, and I made it. And it's like, again, kind of like, I don't know, to this nod of a calling. I was just like, there's something here. I stood in Union Square Farmers Market, New York City, got like 70 people to fill it out. It was a very humbling experience. And I had a lot of different reactions, and some people were like, no, thank you. Others were like, oh, wow, this is so cool. I didn't know death and fun could be in the same sentence. And so I thought, okay, there's definitely something here. I can make this better. But I need to seek out a partner to help me. And that's when I stumbled upon my co-creator of the test, Carolyn, and teamed up with her. She's a journalist with her own grief experience, and very into Buddhism. And so we took my death doula and hospice experience and combined those two to come up with death archetypes. And it truly was just like this thing I thought of in my head that I wanted to make. And there's no like better explanation other than that.
I took the questionnaire, and it was usually when I take like personality stuff, I have a hard time picking an answer, like, because I can reason with both of them and I can see myself in both. But this one I went through, and like there's only two choices for each one, but it was obvious to me which one I was supposed to choose. And I'll share mine with everybody. So when you go, I came back as a mystic. And as I read the definition, I didn't read the definitions of the others, so I don't know if any other one I would have picked. But as I read the mystic, I'm like, yeah, that totally is me. So knowing that I'm a mystic, what do I do with that information to improve my life?
I think it's really interesting. And one thing I'll just say about the formation of the test that I forgot was that, at the time I had wished that there was something like this when I was contemplating mortality, because I didn't have a resource, didn't know where to start. And so this felt like a really easy, accessible way for people to begin reflecting on mortality, and that's totally what it's meant to be, as a reflective tool. And so a note about the death archetypes too, they're meant to be fluid and can change over your lifetime. And each archetype actually has a mirror type. I forget what the mystic is off the top of my head, but I will let you know, so you can look it up and see if it resonates. But from what you said earlier about the fear, or I'd say the discomfort of thinking about leaving your kids before you're ready, or even vice versa, ties deeply into the biggest fear of the mystic, which is losing your loved ones. And some people read that as like, oh, well, that means losing my brother or losing my parent, but it could mean the reverse. It could mean that they lose you as well, because you're just losing that relationship. And so what I would suggest for you, personally, not knowing you that well, but knowing you based off of this, I'm curious if you've done it, and in a way you are doing it, as you mentioned with your podcast, but creating a specific ethical will for your boys, for your children. And that could look in a number of different ways. It could be done in a podcast, it could be done in a letter, it could be done in a video, and you can format it on all sorts of things. I've seen some people do like, okay, this is my philosophy on love and money and whatnot. And other people, I've seen them do it when they reach a sort of a milestone birthday. Say you're turning 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 or whatnot, and you write down like my 50 pieces of advice. For me personally, the reason why I share this is that my mom, while she was dying, while she was on hospice, wrote my sister and I a few letters, and they're like my most prized possession.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be hard to do these things, if you're unprepared, and that's why I suggest doing them while you're around and healthy. But I I get kind of choked up saying this. I know that I just got engaged,
Mm-hmm.
and so I'm planning my wedding, which has brought up a lot of grief for me knowing that my mom won't be there. Um, but I do know that, whew, I know that I have a letter waiting for me
Mm-hmm.
from her that she wrote before she died. And so that's, you can't pay for that
Mm-hmm.
type of stuff. And so I share that because I want to pass that message on to anyone listening to this, whether
Mm-hmm.
you have children, whether you don't, um, you know, just writing a love note. Maybe it's once a year you do it, or maybe it's one and done and you never look at it again. But um, those are the things we don't set aside the time for that often mean the most.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for sharing, and congratulations on the engagement.
Thank you.
And I really do want you to know how much I appreciate the willingness to talk about that and get emotional, because that emotion might have just made somebody watching or listening make that a practice. Like if you would have glanced over that, or that will make somebody actually take action to give their child the same thing that you are going to receive as well. And I think that's so cool. And I've never heard of an ethical will before, but
Yeah.
now I understand what it is. And just high level, what I think it is, it's just basically documenting the things that you find important, or things you want to pass on to your kids or family or whomever, the world, but having it so it's not just like left up to interpretation. It's actually spelling it out. You're putting your ethics out in a format for people to know what it is, and pass that on. So I think that's a really cool idea. And again, appreciate you sharing that with everybody.
Yeah.
And yes, I do think as a mystic, the loss of loved ones, I can't even think about, like, I can think about me being gone. I can't even think about the boys being gone or my wife being gone. Like,
Yeah.
that is the double side of it, but I can't even think about that. So we'll keep on
That's
moving on.
totally fair. Yeah.
We'll move on past that. I think I probably should have asked this quote before, but I do want to bring it back up because I took it from your conversation. But and you alluded on a little bit more, or you alluded on a little bit, but you said our true fear isn't death; it's living a life without meaning. So it's
Mm.
not quite the same as being, losing relevance or our space in the world, but like living a life without meaning. Do you have anything more beyond that? I mean, it kind of speaks for itself, but I don't know if you have any more thoughts beyond that quote.
Yeah. And I'm gonna take my glasses off because they're
Hmm.
fogging up. It ties for me personally. I mean, I think you can interpret it the way that you want. It ties back to living an authentic life, because we decide what we make meaning, of what the point of life is, what our purpose is. That all comes from us, and so it's making sure you set aside the time to truly reflect on those things, like what is important to you and what do you think happens after death, and how does that influence how you want to live your life right now. What are your values, what are your priorities, and then living through your values. So in our death in the death plan, part of an exercise I do with people is borrowed from Brene Brown, and it's about identifying your values, but for end of life specifically,
Hmm.
and just using that as a tool to reframe where you are today as well. So that's essentially what I think living, a meaningful life encapsulates, is just identifying what are the things that you love and what are your values, and how are you using that as sort of a North Star to guide you with decision making.
Well, when I think about everything you've shared, because I want to hop over to Hella Mortal now and talk a little bit more about the business side of things and direct people there, because I think that there are many ways for us to find our way to living an authentic life and who we really are and what we truly value. I talk often about aligning spirit, mind, and body, and how we can do that to kind of help find our way. But if that's not working or you're not figuring it out, I think contemplating mortality and thinking about the things that Maura's talked about and Hella Mortal does can also help you figure out what those values are that now you can use to kind of direct the path that you're going. I'm curious, though, as we get into Hella Mortal, you mentioned before the fear of unknown. And over the last few months, I've really become interested in reading and learning about experiences post-death. People who have died and come back to life, and what did they experience and what do they remember? Right now, I don't think there's anything on there. Do you think Hello Mortal branches out to like what has been said about the afterlife to kind of help bring back to understanding death, or do you think you'll just leave that alone?
Oh, I mean, no, I'd love to make content on it. I am obsessed with near-death experiences.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're so interesting, so fascinating. And recently read Sebastian Junger's book, In My Time of Dying, I believe it's called. And then saw him actually speak about it in Truro on Cape Cod over the summer. And so I think part of the reason, people are afraid of death, right, is the fear of the unknown. And how do you overcome a fear? It's educating yourself. It's going out, doing things, getting experiences, reading, talking to people, and formulating your own opinion of what happens at death and after death. And so I think it's super powerful to read about and listen about these near-death experiences. And so, no plans at the moment to sort of incorporate that in a productized way, but definitely through content. I'd love to do an interview with someone about it. I've had a few phone calls with people who are open to sharing their experiences, but yeah, like you, I find it very, very interesting.
I have a friend who might be open to sharing. I'll have to ask him and see if he'd be willing to talk to you about his experience. But
yeah,
I would agree that it's the way you overcome fears, educate yourself and understand, because then it's no longer unknown. But I would encourage people, if you go down that path of exploring afterlife, go through it with an open mind, because faith determines so much of what we think the afterlife is about. And like, I grew up Catholic, so it's one and done. You die, you go to heaven, that's it. But like a lot of things I've read is that that's not necessarily it, and that our souls, are here to learn for future. And like, I never thought I would actually believe that, but in reading these books and hearing these stories and talking to people that make me think that it is a possibility, and then I come back and look at my life, and I happen to know things just in my core. I know certain things that I don't know how I know it, other than maybe the possibility is this is not my first rodeo, and I learned that through another experience to make this experience better. So I just share all that because I believe things, and in reading things that I never thought I would have believed or read, and I went into it with an open mind, and then developed my own opinion, which I think is a huge comment that you made, is like, develop your own opinion. And if that's in line with what you've always believed, great. And if it's not, I think that's okay as well, because if our soul's job down here is to learn, you're learning this stuff for a reason. Like, so don't go into it, stuck to what you believe. I'd say go into it with an open mind. So I'm excited to see that content come to Hella Mortal. But when you think about Hella Mortal, it's the newsletter now. You guys have a course, right? And then you have something you're getting ready to release, or is it already out?
So it started as a newsletter, which we are actually updating to produce on a weekly basis. We're kind of going through a little bit of a change right now after 6 months of writing content and learnings, and we're going to try to produce some shorter, more digestible contemplations, and then we'll be hosting for paid subscribers a intimate monthly salon where we gather together and discuss certain topics and content that had come out the month prior. And we did a test run with this, and it was so fun. I was really nervous at first. I was like, are people going to show up? Do they want to talk about this? But we had such a diverse group, and the conversations were always just left me feeling super energized. So it's something I'm excited to offer for people who are invested in it. And then we are launching this at the end of this month, the pilot of our death plan course. So essentially, it's 8 weeks. We meet once a week, and at the end of it, you'll have a full comprehensive death plan, otherwise known as an end of life plan. We're life's final folder. We're working on the naming, but we cover topics such as advanced directives, funeral directives, ethical wills, digital afterlife, social media, a lot of the emotional logistics too involved in preparing for end of life. So, whether you have an estate plan or a will already made, this course is still available to you because we don't touch those sides. We touch many other aspects. And then eventually that will be turned into a self-paced course, which you can do online at any time. And then working on a few other things, but that's our main focus for now.
2 quick business comments. First off, I think the get together every month to talk about subjects is a great idea. I have this belief that with all this technology, we know this to be true, but people are going to crave more intimacy with other people, conversations. And I think that like today, courses are the thing that everybody, like every influencer has a course. And not to downplay the course that you're building, like that's a legitimate course, but everybody has a course. I think in the future, everybody is going to have a retreat or some type of social gathering. And what I want to do is something similar to what you have already done. So it gives me confidence. I want to find a short article or a podcast or a video and say, I'm going to run a room for 10 people. The requirement is you watch or listen or read to this, and then let's have a conversation about it. You don't know who's going to show up, but it's getting like-minded people together. And I think that human connection over a common interest and conversation is going to be really, really valuable and meaningful to people. So it's so cool that you're doing that. And then the other business comment is, I've got to figure out how to get you, if you're not already in the space, in front of more financial advisors. Yeah. Because this type of stuff, like I'm cool as an advisor talking about it. I'm comfortable with it. Like I'm bringing woo to finance and let's get spiritual and let's talk about these tough things. But most advisors don't want to talk about it. And I don't think attorneys are talking about it either. So the course that you're putting together is a perfect complement to your traditional will and trust, because they might touch on a few of those things, but maybe not to the level that you are. And there's a need, and advisors are uniquely in a position to have those conversations with their clients about it. So I think that Hello Mortal has a place somewhere in the financial advisor community. We just got to figure out what that is, because it'd be a massive value add to advisors, and it would obviously be helpful to your efforts.
I completely agree, because as I mentioned, we don't touch really estate planning or traditional wills at all. It's very much more some of like surface level logistics, but a lot of the emotional logistics too.
Yeah, that us robot advisors don't want to talk about. So
yeah.
Perfect spot. At minimum, at conferences speaking, we should see you there. What's your big hope for Hello Mortal? Like when you look back, we talked about legacy and certain things. When you look back, what do you hope Hello Mortal does? Like how will you know it's achieved what you want it to?
If we can, we have a big challenge, which is changing behavior. So I will know we've been successful when I see the statistics rise on folks who have completed an advanced directive. I will know we have succeeded when we start speaking about death as a sacred experience as opposed to something to be avoided, because really we do ourselves and society at large a disservice by not talking about it. It's a universal, inevitable human experience, and so it's like we know it's coming, but we just avoid it at all costs, when it can be there's so many positive effects of just talking about it and planning ahead. And two, we could get down to metrics and KPIs and stuff, but I do hope to see the newsletter grow and see people have more interest in it. And same thing with death archetypes. The more people who take it, the more people who are exposed to the language and the mission and the idea. And ultimately, I think we'll start seeing this shift. And those are my hopes. I just hope we reach people and we make a difference. And like you said, if someone listening to this decides to write a letter to their child or whomever in the event of an unexpected death, or even in the event of their inevitable death, it can happen at any time, that's a success, just one person, one letter at a time. That's a win in my book.
Well, I can guarantee you this episode will make one person do it. If he hasn't already done it, my dad will do it. And my dad will be the first one to drop a comment in the comment section. But I guarantee if he hasn't already done it, he'll be writing a letter after listening to this episode. So I hope to not read that letter for a long time. But I know that you'll have one person you impacted. And I'm going to do the same. Like, I have all of this stuff here, but it's not all put together. So having something for the boys and even my wife would be pretty cool. So, well, Maura, I want to thank you for your time. And I also want to make sure we make it super easy for everybody to find you in Hello Mortal. So I'll link to all the show notes and everything. But where do we want to direct everybody to follow you and follow the work that you're doing?
Yeah, just hellomortal.com, hellomortal.com, and everything's right there. You can access Death Archetypes, you can access the Death Plan. Our socials are there too. We're just hellomortal _ on Instagram, and that's where you can find everything.
Awesome. Well, thank you again very much for joining me. And also thank you for the work, because I do think it is going to make a difference in a lot of people's lives. And the work will help people live a more authentic life as they figure out who they are by thinking about their mortality. So I consider you an ally in the work that I'm doing. So thank you for all that great work.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. This was fun.